Hey there. Tonight, we are following a very old whisper into the dark. Recently, researchers used advanced language models, imaging systems, and pattern recognition software to compare the Voynich manuscript against hundreds of historical scripts. And what came back was not a clean translation, but something colder. The machine did not open the book like a door. It only touched the handle, and even that was enough to make the room feel smaller. If you enjoy these slow, strange journeys, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and then settle in with me. Lower the lights. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing grow slow and even. Imagine a quiet archive after midnight. The air cool, the lamps low. A single old book waiting under glass as if it has been patient for longer than memory. It begins, as so many uneasy stories do, with a book that should not feel alive, and yet somehow does. 200 or so vellum pages, painted plants that do not quite belong to any earthly garden, bathing women floating in green channels like veins, zodiac wheels turning with the calm of a hidden clock, and line after line of script that looks almost readable until you lean too close and realize it belongs nowhere. You know. The letters curve like reeds in dark water. The words repeat like prayer, or like machinery. Everything about it carries the soft, stubborn confidence of a real language. And yet for centuries, it has refused every hand that tried to lift its veil. I have always found that detail strangely intimate. A forged book can fool people for a while, of course. A prank can survive longer than dignity sometimes. Human beings are very talented at inventing nonsense with a straight face, but the Voynich manuscript has worn out generations of bright minds, and still it sits there with the patience of stone. Renaissance collectors stared at it. Scholars traced its symbols. Cryptographers fed it into systems built to break wartime ciphers. Even men who worked around the edges of the great code wars of the 20th century gave it a respectful glance and then a tired silence. That kind of endurance gives an object a presence. Not magic exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to resistance. The modern story usually begins in 1912, when Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer with a taste for the rare and the theatrical, acquired the manuscript from a Jesuit collection. It entered the world again, like an old creature blinking at the light. The vellum was later carbon dated to the early 15th century, the late 1400s, which means the pages themselves are real enough. Animal skin, prepared by patient human hands half a millennium ago. That matters. It does not prove the writing says anything. It does not prove the drawings are truthful. But it means the object was not typed up last week by a bored eccentric in a basement who had access to green ink and too much free time. It is old. It is real. It was made with intention. And that intention is where the chill begins. When you imagine it, do not imagine a clean modern archive at first. Imagine the manuscript before the vault, before the Yale shelf, before the glass and controlled temperature. Imagine it on a wooden table in a room where the candles gutter and the shutters rattle. Imagine the smell of vellum warming near a small flame. Imagine a hand pausing over the page, perhaps not out of confusion, but out of caution. Because one of the darker possibilities around the Voynich manuscript has always been the simplest one. The reason nobody can read it may be that someone never wanted it read by the wrong people. Not hidden in the theatrical way of treasure maps and secret societies wearing dramatic robes. Hidden in the practical human way. Knowledge preserved inside a wall of symbols so that only a narrow circle could enter. That possibility is what gave the recent AI experiments such force. It was not simply that a machine was being pointed at an old puzzle. It was that the machine promised a new style of looking, colder than intuition, less romantic than the scholar with the magnifying glass, and far more tireless. Researchers in the 21st century began feeding the manuscript into models trained not to admire it, but to compare it. Statistical fingerprints, pattern density, letter adjacency, repeated structures across lines and paragraphs, ink flow, character clustering, the sort of work that sounds bloodless until you remember what it means. A modern system can sit in the dark with an ancient book and compare its pulse against hundreds of known languages without once becoming bored, hungry, proud, or frightened. And still, even before the supposed breakthrough, the manuscript fought back in its own quiet way. Because it is not merely unreadable. It is alluring. Pages seem to offer categories of meaning without ever delivering certainty. Here are plants, but not plants anyone can firmly name. Here are naked figures in liquid, but not scenes anyone can securely interpret. Here are stars and circular diagrams, but no stable calendar. It is like being shown the bones of a world that never fully touched ours. Honestly, that may be one reason the thing has survived in imagination so well. A completely mute object grows dull after a while. The Voynich manuscript is not mute. It whispers just enough to make people lean closer. The handwriting adds to that effect. Not because it is especially wild, but because it is too steady, too practiced. The lines are confident. The scribe, or perhaps the scribes, were not doodling. They were not hesitating over every symbol as though inventing them on the fly. The script moves with the fluency of use. That is one of the details that researchers often return to. If it is a hoax, it is a terribly disciplined one. If it is an invented language, it is an invented language used with remarkable consistency. If it is a cipher, then it may be preserving something specific, and perhaps something valuable enough to justify all that labor. This is where the AI story enters with such seductive force. A human scholar can become attached to a theory, and the theory begins to tint the page. A machine, in theory, does not care. It simply sees shape, count, pattern. In one of the most widely discussed efforts, researchers trained a system on hundreds of languages and then let it compare the Voynich text against those statistical patterns. Not read it. That is important. People say reading when they mean matching, and the difference is the difference between a heartbeat and an echo. The AI was not sitting there understanding herbs, prayers, or astronomy. It was just testing structure against structure, searching for a family resemblance across enormous quantities of text. Recently, when those kinds of tools were turned loose on the manuscript with more confidence and more computing power than ever before, they began returning a possibility that thrilled journalists and alarmed specialists in almost equal measure. Hidden inside the nonsense The model said there might be the ghost of Hebrew. Not plain Hebrew on the surface. Something altered. Something stripped of vowels. Maybe rearranged. Maybe dressed in another script. In other words, not a translation, not a victory, but a scent in the air. A trace. And once that trace appeared, the room changed. You know that feeling when one small explanation is almost worse than no explanation at all. If the manuscript were pure gibberish, it would become an object lesson in human eccentricity, and we could all sleep more easily. If it were straightforwardly readable, it would become a historical document, however strange, and the fever would pass into footnotes and catalog entries. But to sit in the middle ground, to be possibly meaningful, possibly concealed, possibly one bad assumption away from revelation, that is where real obsessions grow. A lock is one thing. A lock that gives a little when you touch it is another. So let us stay with that image for a moment. A lab in the glow of late screens. The manuscript flattened into scans. Columns of numbers replacing ink. Software comparing sequences the way a winter mind compares shadows in a hallway. Outside, modern life goes on with its buzzing messages and bright, efficient nonsense. Inside, an old book from the 1500s waits while a machine tries to guess what kind of breath once moved through it. The researchers are not priests and not magicians, though people will always dress them that way in the telling. They are doing what modern people do when faced with a silence that embarrasses them. They are asking a stronger machine to listen. The public loved that immediately. Of course. I cannot even blame them. The phrase itself has a sort of dangerous sweetness. AI decodes the most mysterious book in the world. It sounds like the beginning of a revelation and the end of patience. It promises what every age wants, that the old barrier has finally fallen, that mystery has been outpaced, that centuries of stubbornness can be broken by enough data and enough electrical light. But ancient things have a way of punishing haste. And the Voynich Manuscript, sitting there with its unread flowers and its impossible baths, was about to remind everyone that pattern is not the same as meaning. Before we reach that disappointment, though, I want you to feel the excitement as it would have felt in the moment, because that excitement is part of the story too. Imagine the first reports sliding out into the world. Headlines bright with certainty. Scholars annoyed before breakfast. Curious readers leaning over articles as if the truth might be hanging just below the fold. Perhaps somewhere a lonely collector in a small apartment reads the words and feels a physical thrill in the chest. At last. At last. The dark book speaks. That hope matters because hope is one of the oldest engines of error, and one of the tenderest. Yet hope can also sharpen the senses. It made people look again at what had always been on the page. The short words, the repeated clusters, the slightly flowing order that never quite collapses into random disorder. It made them wonder whether the book was not an alien thing after all, but a human one wearing a mask. A hidden medical text, an herbal manual, a private record, a map of the body in the sky. Some even liked the thought that it might contain ordinary advice wrapped in extraordinary concealment, the way a frightened age might hide practical knowledge from hostile eyes. By the time the AI claim began to spread, the manuscript had already become more than paper. It had become a mirror for whatever people feared losing. Rationalists saw an unbroken cipher daring them to prove that everything yields. Mystics saw a gate. Historians saw a displaced object from a lost circle of thought. Conspiracy-minded dreamers saw every forbidden archive they had ever imagined. The book absorbed all of it without changing. And now a machine had come to lay one cool hand on its cover. So as you settle deeper into your blanket, picture the scene very clearly. A room within a room. A library within a university. A locked shelf within an archive. A manuscript within its box. The pages pale as old skin. The ink brown and patient. The drawings touched by green, to blue, rust, and that soft herbal yellow that makes even the strangest plant seem almost medicinal. On the first page, there is writing nobody can read with confidence. On the later pages, there are women in tubes and pools and stars arranged like mechanisms. Above all of it, there is the long wait of failed interpretation. And now, very gently, modern AI leans over the text and says, "Not I understand you, but I think I recognize the scent of your language." That was enough to wake the house. And in the hush that followed, the next stage began. Not the solving, not really. Something more fragile, and in its own way more unsettling. The attempt to turn that faint scent into an actual sentence, and to see whether the book would finally say something simple, human, and devastating, or whether it would continue doing what it has always done best, which is make bright minds speak first and understand later. The attempt began with the most tempting place imaginable. The first line, the threshold line. If a sealed book is ever going to betray itself, people like to think it will do so on the first page, where the author still remembers the shape of an opening, where the hand is steady and the purpose is fresh. So the researchers took the opening stretch of Voynich text and let the machine apply its strange kindness. If the language underneath really was some altered form of Hebrew, if vowels had been removed and letters shuffled into disguises, then perhaps the first line could be coaxed back toward breath. I want you to imagine that process slowly, because there is something almost tender about it. Not romantic, not quite. More like a surgeon preparing instruments beside a sleeping patient whose pulse may already be gone. The old symbols are lifted from the page into code. Each word becomes a little cage of letters. The system tests possibilities, rearranges, compares. The room is modern, but the sensation is ancient. A group of people waiting for one line from the dark. One clear line. One phrase that would not crumble when touched. At first, nothing beautiful happened. That is worth saying softly. The output was still nonsense. The machine did not sing. The manuscript did not unfold like a flower in warm water. The first attempts produced the sort of strained fragments that make researchers rub tired eyes and tell themselves the next pass will be better. But disappointment, when it arrives after a long obsession, rarely ends the work. It sharpens it. So manual adjustments entered. A guessed vowel here. A corrected assumption there. A human nudge to help the machine across ground it could not cross by itself. This is where the story grows strange in a very modern way. The age of candles hid its manipulations in shadows. Our age hides them in interfaces. A line appears on a screen, still awkward, still limping. Then another tool is summoned. Translation software. A second machine placed behind the first. Not because the door has been opened, but because someone wants to know what might be visible through the keyhole if the angle is just right. And at last, after the nudging and smoothing and hoping, the sentence arrives. She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and me and people. That was the line. Not thunder, not prophecy, not a botanical recipe glowing with obvious use, not a confession or a map or a prayer. Just that odd sentence, assembled out of 6 centuries of silence, like a chair put together from mismatched pieces in a dark attic. It is grammatical. Mostly, it has the posture of sense. But when you look straight at it, something in it seems to lean away. Honestly, I think that is the moment the whole affair became more eerie than triumphant. If the output had been obviously absurd, people could have laughed and folded the story back into the cabinet. If it had been beautifully clear, the world would have changed in a more orderly way. But this line sat there in that uncomfortable human middle ground, too shaped to dismiss instantly, too awkward to trust. It sounded like the beginning of a letter that had forgotten where it came from, or a memory translated one time too many, or one of those sentences overheard through a wall that seems important until you step into the room and discover the mood has nothing to do with your imagination. Still, the excitement spread. It had to. We are creatures of openings. Give us one sentence from the abyss, and we will build a staircase around it before noon. Articles appeared. Headlines gleamed. AI solves the Voynich Manuscript. AI cracks the unreadable book. For a brief, bright moment, the public mood shifted from wonder to possession. The impossible text was not impossible anymore. It had started to yield. Whatever else happened, nobody could fully put the genie back in its bottle after that. The sentence existed. The idea existed. The old book had been made to produce something that looked, from a distance, like speech. The researchers pointed to a few other suggestive fragments as well. Small words, everyday terms, hints that perhaps certain repeated forms in the herbal pages could correspond to ordinary nouns if handled the same way. Light, air, fire, farmer. The words themselves were simple, almost disappointingly so, which made them feel more believable to many readers. There is a common hunger in all decipherment stories for the humble key. Not some grand cosmic declaration, but a kitchen word, a household word, the sort of thing that proves a language belongs to ordinary life. If the manuscript contained words for air and fire, then perhaps it really was a human record after all. Maybe an herbal guide, a medical notebook, some private compendium of recipes and observations preserved beneath a veil. That possibility is important because it softened the fear. A book that no one can read feels dangerous in a vague way. A book that turns out to be about roots, remedies, and household advice feels gentler, even if the path to that conclusion is slippery. People like to believe that beneath every labyrinth there is a pantry. Beneath every arcane image, a practical instruction. And the Voynich drawings seemed willing to support that fantasy just enough. The plants, though unidentifiable, still looked plant-like. The bathing figures, though bizarre, could perhaps belong to medicine or women's health or the mapped channels of the body. Once the AI result appeared, the old drawings began to gather new interpretations around themselves, like mist collecting on branches. But stay with the actual scene, not just the headlines. Stay with the first sentence on the screen. She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and me and people. Read it slowly. There is an antique rhythm to it. Yes, something stiff and slightly ceremonial, yet also something hollow. Who is she? What recommendations? Why the priest? Why man of the house? Why me and people? It sounds almost like a translation out of damaged scripture, except scripture usually knows where it is going. This line feels as though it has arrived without bringing the road behind it. And that is what so many people missed in the first flush of excitement. The machine did not truly read the line from the page in a single clean act. The line had been coaxed, helped, pressed into shape through assumptions. The manuscript had not simply opened its mouth. It had been interpreted through layers of modern systems, each one good at smoothing rough edges. You know that feeling when a stranger smiles a little too perfectly and you realize the expression is correct before it is sincere. That is how the sentence feels to me. Not false in the simplest sense. More like assisted into coherence. Still, there was real drama in the idea itself. Imagine a hidden Hebrew text, medieval and masked, lying untouched beneath centuries of bafflement. Imagine a writer taking ordinary words, stripping away vowels, then rearranging letters, not to create a beautiful literary cipher, but to prevent easy entry. That is not impossible. Human beings have always loved half-practical secrecy. Merchants, physicians, priests, alchemists, anyone who believes knowledge has value tends to build a small wall around it. If the Voynich manuscript was doing something like that, then suddenly the whole object shifts from alien relic to protected archive. Not a message from nowhere, but a message from somewhere hidden. The media, naturally, preferred the larger version of the story. Machines against mystery. Silicon versus vellum. Modern intelligence versus medieval concealment. It is a lovely contest to imagine beside a fireplace because it flatters both sides. The old book becomes noble in its resistance. The modern machine becomes heroic in its persistence. But reality is softer, and in some ways sadder. The machine was never heroic. It was dutiful. The book was never an enemy. It was silent. The real drama sat in the middle, in the very human desire to be the generation that finally ends the embarrassment. I think that is why the first sentence mattered so much. Not because it said anything unforgettable, but because it allowed people to believe the age of waiting had ended. For a few days, perhaps a few weeks, if one was not reading closely, it seemed possible that the Voynich manuscript had stepped down from its high shelf and entered history in an ordinary way. Soon there would be papers, better translations, perhaps arguments over botanical identifications and scribal schools and the exact flavor of medieval Hebrew used in the hidden original. Soon the strange women in the green pools would be assigned their places. Soon the stars would become a calendar. Soon the impossible book would become one more difficult text. But the thing about old mysteries is that they often punish the word soon. The more one looked at the method, the more the result felt like a dream that begins to unravel after breakfast. The sentence, when repeated aloud, did not deepen. It thinned. The individual chosen words seemed less like discoveries and more like coincidences allowed to bloom under favorable light. The reliance on manual correction started to matter. The role of translation software started to matter even more. Because a machine that predicts language can produce something smooth out of almost anything, provided the human guiding it is willing to give it enough rope. If you were standing here with me by the fire, I would probably read the line once more and then let the room go quiet around it. Not to mock it. That would be too easy. But to let its strangeness settle honestly. She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and me and people. It has the shape of recovered speech and the soul of an unfinished puzzle. It does not tell us what the book is. It does not prove the language. It does not unlock the script. It only proves that, if you work hard enough, a modern system can help produce a sentence-shaped object from the surface of a mystery. And perhaps that is the most modern fear hidden in the story. Not that the manuscript will remain unread, but that the first voice we hear from it will be one we accidentally invented. Let the image widen now. The news cycle churning. Writers eager for wonder. Readers eager for closure. Somewhere, a scholar who has spent 20 years with the manuscript feels that peculiar cold irritation reserved for people who love a mystery enough to mistrust easy weddings. Somewhere else, a programmer feels genuine excitement, perhaps even pride, because something did happen, something statistically interesting and undeniably new. These responses are both human and both understandable. The problem is not enthusiasm. The problem is the ancient one. We confuse a door that moves with a door that opens. The manuscript itself, meanwhile, changes not at all. Its plants remain impossible. Its script remains lonely. Its pages remain filled with that soft, repetitive confidence that has led some people to suspect natural language, others to suspect sophisticated nonsense, and still others to suspect a code system built for a very narrow audience. If the AI result did anything lasting, it was not to solve the object. It was to drag the object back into the deepest pool of public imagination. Suddenly, people who had never heard of the Voynich Manuscript were staring at its pages late at night. Suddenly, the little green pools and stars and herbs were alive again across thousands of screens. There is a kind of second life created by failed solutions. The first life of a mystery belongs to the object itself. The second belongs to the false dawns, the claimed breakthroughs, the theories that rise and fall like winter breath on glass. In that sense, the AI decoding became part of the manuscript history immediately, whether correct or not. Another attempt, another voice at the door, another instance of a clever age believing it had found the right angle of entry. What I find most haunting is how the first sentence does not entirely collapse, even when doubt begins. It lingers. Not because it convinces, but because it almost does. That is a subtle and dangerous quality. A complete fraud leaves a bad taste and then dissolves. A partial illusion hangs around the room like smoke. For a while, every time one returns to the first page, one cannot help hearing the ghost of that line under the unread symbols. Recommendations: priest, house, me, people. It is like hearing footsteps in a corridor you know is empty. And so the story moves gently toward its correction. The bright moment dims. Experts start clearing their throats. Medievalists narrow their eyes. Linguists begin to point out what should have been obvious from the start. Though, of course, obvious things rarely shine as brightly as reckless ones. The book has not been solved. The sentence is not enough. The machine may have touched a pattern, or it may have simply smoothed noise into a familiar shape. Either way, the silence of the manuscript has not been broken. It has only been interrupted. That interruption, however brief, tells us some truth carrying into the dark with us. Not about hidden Hebrew necessarily, and not yet about the true contents of the book. It tells us how badly we want ancient things to answer when modern tools lean over them. It tells us how quickly a single line can become a revelation if it arrives wrapped in the authority of code. And it tells us that the Voynich Manuscript, for all its age and stillness, remains more agile than the people trying to pin it down. As the fire settles lower, picture the first page again. Picture the machine-generated hope pooled over it like lamplight. Picture the line that seemed to emerge, awkward and ceremonial, and somehow already decaying as it was born. Then picture the manuscript itself, unchanged beneath the attention, like a lake that permits one distorted reflection and then closes smooth again. That is where we are as this part of the story ends. Not at revelation, not even at true translation. We are standing in the softer, darker place after excitement, where the mind begins to ask whether the machine found a thread or whether it only taught us how easily human beings can mistake shape for truth. And once that question enters the room, the real unraveling begins. By the time the first wave of excitement began to cool, the colder voices entered the room. They did not slam the door. They did not throw the machine out the window. Scholars rarely behave so theatrically, no matter how convenient that would be for storytelling. Instead, they did something quieter, and in some ways much more devastating. They read the claim slowly. They compared method to conclusion. They held the bright new sentence up to the light, turned it a little, and began to show where the seams were. I have always respected that stage of a mystery, even when it bruises a lovely story. The first claim arrives like a spark. The correction arrives like snow. Soft at first, then everywhere. You can almost feel the temperature change as specialists begin to speak. A medievalist clears her throat and points to the dating problem. A computational linguist notes that the highest score in a pattern-matching system is still just the least bad fit among many weak ones. A manuscript scholar who has lived with the book for years smiles in that tired way experts do when the world rediscovers an old problem and rushes to crown the first answer wearing a modern hat. One of the strongest objections was also one of the simplest. The system had been trained on the wrong kind of language. Not merely the wrong family, perhaps, though that remained uncertain, but the wrong century, the wrong linguistic weather, the wrong human mouth. A machine raised on modern or near-modern language patterns is not standing where a 15th century scribe stood. Language shifts. It dries and blooms and sheds meanings with the centuries. Even when a modern speaker feels close to an old form of the same language, the closeness can be deceptive, like recognizing the bones of a face in a portrait and missing everything that once moved across it. Picture it this way. Suppose you taught a bright, diligent student only the language of your own street, your own time, your own clipped quick era. Then you sat that student down in front of a room full of murmuring voices from centuries ago. The student might catch rhythms, a repeated sound, a familiar root, the posture of a sentence. But that is not understanding. That is eavesdropping from the wrong doorway. To many experts, that is exactly what the AI had done. It had listened with the wrong ears and then been praised for hearing a ghost of a familiar accent. This matters more than people realize, because the Voynich Manuscript is already a problem of distance. Distance in time. Distance in script. Distance in habit of thought. Add one more distance. A machine trained on modern materials instead of the difficult, dusty, stubborn language world of the late medieval period. And the gap becomes not a crack, but a river. Some scholars put it bluntly. If you train a system on modern Hebrew or modern representations of any language, and then ask it to solve a cryptic document from the 15th century, you are not really decoding the manuscript. You are asking it which modern shirt the old body most resembles in the dark. Then there was the second objection, which on its face sounds technical, but underneath it is almost philosophical. The highest scoring language in a pattern test does not automatically deserve a crown. A machine will always rank something first. It cannot shrug elegantly and say, "I do not know." That is not how such systems are built. They are engines of probable output. They are compelled toward an answer the way water is compelled downhill. Hebrew may have finished above the other candidates. Yes. But some of the other candidates were strange enough to make the result wobble at once. If another very different language sits just behind the winner, then the winner may not be triumphant at all. It may only be standing on a very small hill in a very large fog. That detail, to me, feels almost poetic. We want first place to mean destiny. We want the best match to sound like revelation. But the machine was not handing down law. It was sorting resemblance. If a human face in a crowd is the most familiar one there, that does not mean it is your brother. It may simply mean all the faces are strangers, and one of them shares the tilt of a brow. The third objection cut deeper, because it reached into the heart of the proposed method itself. The entire translation attempt depended on a startlingly generous assumption that each Voynich word could be treated as a kind of rearranged shell, an anagram of a Hebrew word with vowels removed. Once you allow that much flexibility, the room changes. Letters can be moved. Missing sounds can be supplied. Ambiguity becomes not a problem, but a playground. And that is dangerous. Not because it is absurd. People have encoded language in more elaborate ways than that. Dangerous because if your method permits too much reshaping, then meaning begins to arrive not from the page, but from the interpreter. You know that feeling when someone tells you they can see an animal in the clouds, and suddenly you see it too. A fox, a hand, a ship. The shape is there, but only after the suggestion. That is how many critics felt about the AI solution. Once the assumption was made, once the reader was told to strip the vowels, reorder the letters, and lean toward Hebrew, then of course little points of contact began to appear. A simple word here, a term for light there. But chance is generous when the rules are loose. Give a person a sack of letters and enough patience, and sooner or later they will pull out a recognizable word and call it destiny. The role of manual tweaking made the whole thing still more delicate. The machine did not stride from darkness carrying a sentence in clean hands. Human fingers were there all along, adjusting, smoothing, guessing where the path might be. Then translation software stepped in to do what such systems are built to do. Make things sound normal. Make roughness flow. Produce the most probable sentence-shaped output from incomplete or awkward material. This is one of those modern details that feels almost comic until you sit with it. An ancient manuscript no one can read, nudged into semi-legibility by one system, then passed to another system famous for turning uncertain input into polished language. There is something faintly theatrical about it, like hiring two tailors to convince the town a shadow has shoulders. And this is where the criticism became truly sharp. Because translation software is not a neutral mirror. It is helpful by design. It fills gaps. It smooths irregularities. It wants to hand you something usable, even if the original material was unstable. So that famous sentence, the one about the priest and the house and the people, began to look less like a recovered truth and more like a collaboration between uncertainty and assistance. The machine did not reveal the line from the manuscript the way a lantern reveals a face. It assembled it the way mist assembles a face, if you stare long enough at the glass. One expert compared the entire performance to spectacle, and I understand why. A giant ancient mystery. A dazzling modern machine. A sentence appearing out of nonsense with just enough shape to keep the cameras rolling. The public does not often get to watch scholarship in real time, and when it does, it prefers fireworks. But scholarship is not a firework art. It is a slow winter art. It requires the patience to say, not yet, or no, or this is interesting but not true enough to trust. Those are deeply unfashionable phrases in any age, and especially in an age that wants its mysteries solved by the end of the article. The manuscript community, those tireless people who have spent years inside this problem, mostly responded with that winter patience. Some were wry, some were openly irritated. A few were almost amused by how quickly the headlines ran ahead of the evidence. Their objection was not to AI as such. That is important. Very few serious scholars reject a tool because it is new. They reject claims that overreach what the tool has actually done. To them, this was not a solved manuscript. It was an experiment whose result had been dressed up for a parade. And perhaps that is the phrase to hold for a moment. Dressed up for a parade. Because the underlying effort was real. Patterns were analyzed. Statistical comparisons were made. Hypotheses were generated. There is honest work in that. But honest work can still produce a false dawn, especially when the world is eager to believe that enough computing power can flatten any old silence. The experts were not merely defending territory. They were defending standards of proof. They were saying, in essence, a sentence that almost makes sense is not the same thing as a decipherment. A top language guess is not the same thing as a verified original. A method that can generate a nice headline is not yet a key. One scholar said, in spirit, if not exactly in these words, that after all the excitement, we were still unable to read a single word of the manuscript with confidence. I find that oddly calming, not because failure is pleasing, but because it restores scale. The Voynich manuscript did not become ordinary just because a bright machine brushed against it. Its pages remained what they had been the day before. Unread, unsettling, dense with suggestion and empty of certainty. The old silence settled back over the text like dust after applause. And yet the correction itself left a residue. Once the idea of AI had entered the Voynich story, it could not be fully removed. Even the scholars who rejected this specific attempt knew the game had changed a little. New tools would come. Better models. Better training data. More careful collaborations between coders and historians and linguists who understand the weight of a medieval hand on vellum. This first effort may have stumbled, but it also marked a threshold. The machine had arrived at the door. It had not entered, but it had learned the shape of the handle. If you were sitting in the archive after everyone left, after the headlines and the rebuttals and the little storms of opinion had passed, the manuscript would look the same under its careful light. That may be the strangest thing of all. Human beings can build whole climates of excitement around an object, and the object remains perfectly still. The Voynich manuscript does not care whether it is thought solved or unsolved. It lies there in that composed script, with its impossible gardens and bathing figures and wheels of stars, as if to remind us that being the center of attention is not the same as being understood. So the bright answer dimmed. The machine had not conquered the vellum. The sentence had not opened a path through the book. The experts had done what experts are meant to do. They had turned the manuscript back into a question. A harder question now, perhaps, because one more false path had been walked so confidently, but also a cleaner one. The air after skepticism can feel cold. Yes. It can also feel breathable. What remained, as the dust settled, was a quieter and more interesting challenge. If this AI attempt had not solved the book, then what exactly had it shown us about machines, about language, and about our own hunger to be told that the oldest locked door in the room had finally given way? That question would prove deeper than the failed sentence itself, and in some ways more revealing. Because the next thing the Voynich story exposed was not the book's secret, but the peculiar limits of the minds, artificial and human, that kept bending over it with such hope. Once the excitement was stripped back and the criticism had done its sober work, the Voynich story became something richer than a simple failed breakthrough. It became a demonstration, almost a little parable, about what artificial intelligence can do beautifully and what it cannot yet do at all. That may sound less romantic than the promise of a solved manuscript, but stay with me. Some truths are gentler and more durable when the glamour wears off. A machine is very good at not blinking. It is very good at counting. It is very good at standing before a mountain of patterns and noticing the tiny repeated grooves a human eye would grow tired of tracing. Feed it enough material and it will sort, rank, correlate, compare. It will do in an hour what a room of exhausted people might struggle to finish in years. That is not magic. It is also not trivial. In the Voynich case, that capacity mattered. The models could examine character frequencies, recurring structures, the lengths of words, the clustering habits of symbols, and set those against broad language families with a speed and indifference no scholar can imitate. There is something almost monastic about that kind of machine work when you think about it kindly. A patient, non-human novice, sitting in silence, comparing one letter pattern against another until dawn, and then continuing without complaint into the next week, the next month, the next update. It does not become sentimental about the manuscript. It does not grow attached to a theory because the theory has beautiful implications. It does not feel the need to rescue its own reputation if a result turns out wrong. In that sense, AI can be wonderfully cold, and coldness has its uses in scholarship. But coldness is not understanding. That is the hinge on which the whole tale turns. The machine did not know what a medieval herbal might feel like in the hand. It did not know what sorts of instructions a 15th century physician, alchemist, or scribe would be likely to record, and in what tone. It did not know the difference between a marginal note, a prayer, a recipe, and a list of star positions in any lived human sense. It knew pattern, not meaning, not context, not intention. Those are different fires entirely. I think this is where many people, not foolishly, but very naturally, become confused. A sentence comes out of a system and sounds grammatical. Therefore, the system must have understood. But grammar is not the same as truth. We all know people who can speak in smooth, complete sentences while having no idea what they are talking about. Machines, in that respect, are not as alien as we like to pretend. They can produce outputs with the surface grace of understanding because they are built to predict what a plausible line should look like. Plausible is not the same as correct. Plausible is only a well-pressed shirt. Consider how your phone finishes phrases before you do. It is not reading your soul. It is gambling on habit. Scale that up through immense training sets. Add more layers, more sophistication, more delicate mathematical weightings, and you get something astonishingly competent at producing likely continuations. That competence can feel eerily close to thought. Sometimes it is close enough to help a human thinker move faster or ask better questions. But it is still prediction, not inward comprehension. The machine does not sit back from the Voynich page and wonder who wrote it, why the women are bathing in green loops, or whether the plants were meant to heal bodies or symbolize the heavens. It cannot feel the pressure of those possibilities. It can only rank shapes. That is why so many AI outputs feel uncanny in a very specific way. They are often too smooth at the surface and too empty in the center. The sentence from the Voynich experiment had exactly that quality. It stood upright. It wore the clothing of language. Yet when scholars leaned toward it, there was no body heat, just form, just a polished arrangement. Researchers even have a word for this kind of thing now, though it sounds almost too dreamy for such a practical failure. Hallucination. A machine hallucination is not madness. It is confident fabrication. The system has been asked for an answer, and so it produces one, often in the likeliest tone available. even when the ground beneath the answer is air. In the Voynich story, that danger felt especially sharp because the manuscript itself is such a vacuum for desire. People long for it to speak. Give a machine that longing on one side and ambiguous patterns on the other, and there is always a risk that what appears will be not a translation, but a beautifully arranged wish. There is another limit here, quieter but just as important. Machines know only what they have been given, and they are shaped by the diet they have eaten. If a system has feasted on modern corpora, modern grammar, modern distributions of text, then, confronting a deeply strange medieval object may push it toward the nearest familiar ledge, whether or not that ledge belongs to the landscape. This is the old problem of the wrong lantern. You can bring a bright light into a cave and still see the walls inaccurately if the light changes all the colors. The Voynich manuscript is exactly the sort of object that punishes that mismatch. Its script is unique. Its imagery is unstable. Its historical setting is wide enough to be tantalizing and narrow enough to be misleading. There is no perfect training set for it because there is nothing else exactly like it. That does not make computational work useless. It simply means any model approaching it is approaching as a stranger, and strangers are prone to forcing familiarity where none exists. Yet, for all that, I do not think the AI story ends in embarrassment. Not really. It ends in humility, which is a much better ending, because the experiment did reveal something valuable. It showed that computational tools can help map the perimeter of the mystery. They can identify repetitions across pages with extraordinary rigor. They can compare scribal habits, character distributions, and structural regularities. They can test hypotheses faster than a human team could ever manage. They can show us where patterns really are, even if they cannot tell us what those patterns mean. In a manuscript so often overwhelmed by myth and projection, that is not a small gift. Imagine future work done more patiently. Better data sets, more medieval language, material. Systems trained not just on modern statistical patterns, but on the texture of older scripts and older textual habits. Teams where coders do not outrun paleographers, and where historians are not brought in after the headline has already escaped the stable. In that world, AI could become not a flashy conqueror of mysteries, but a lantern bearer. Quiet, useful, limited, honest. That is a role worth wanting for it. There is also a human lesson in this whole affair, and it is not flattering, though perhaps it is kind. We have become very eager to believe that a powerful enough machine will spare us the long ache of uncertainty. The world grows more complex, more saturated with information, and the fantasy of instant solution becomes harder to resist. Point the algorithm at the dark thing. Wait. Receive revelation. It is a lovely modern myth, and like many lovely myths, it contains just enough truth to remain dangerous. Yes, machines can accelerate discovery. Yes, they can reveal structures that hide from tired human perception. But they cannot remove the need for judgment, historical feel, skepticism, and the slow moral discipline of not claiming too much from too little. Perhaps that is why the Voynich manuscript feels almost healthy for our age. It refuses speed. It resists flattening. It embarrasses certainty. Even when dragged into the hottest circuits of AI enthusiasm, it returned the favor by showing how quickly bright, output can become fragile under real scrutiny. There is a kind of dignity in that. The book did not humiliate the machine. It simply reminded everyone that pattern extraction and understanding are not yet the same art. If you sit with that long enough, the manuscript begins to seem less like an enemy and more like a tutor. A stern one, admittedly. It teaches caution. It teaches the value of partnership between tools and people. It teaches that an unread text can still be useful because it reveals the habits of those who try to read it. Every generation presses its own dream against the page. Alchemists saw one thing, cryptographers another, computer scientists another still. The manuscript stays still and lets each age reveal itself in the act of reaching. And still, the desire remains. I can feel it even now, and perhaps you can too. The desire for the next attempt to be different, for the next model to be better trained, less eager to hallucinate, more capable of admitting uncertainty, for the next collaboration between machine and scholar to tease one real thread from the page, not a sentence-shaped cloud, but one true word, a plant name, a month, a body part, a prayer. Something solid enough to hold between finger and thumb. That hope is not foolish. It is one of the more beautiful things about us. But beauty must travel with patience if it is not going to turn into another bright mistake. The older I get, the more I think that unsolved objects perform a strange mercy for the cultures that inherit them. They slow the pulse. They remind us that not all doors are there to be kicked open quickly. Some are there so that whole centuries can gather outside them, learning how to listen better. The Voynich Manuscript may one day yield, and perhaps AI will play a crucial role in that yielding. It may help reconstruct scribal systems. It may locate correspondences invisible to ordinary reading. It may even expose the manuscript as something completely unexpected, a constructed language, a mnemonic device, an encoded handbook, a performance object, a puzzle designed to resist the future. All of that remains possible. But possibility is not the same as possession. The public story, after the AI excitement faded, settled into something almost gentle. The mystery remained intact. Scholars went back to their work. The headlines moved on to fresher astonishments. The manuscript stayed in its vault, quiet as frost. And yet the episode left behind a useful warmth. It reminded many people that human scholarship still matters in ways machines cannot imitate. The deep knowledge of scripts, inks, scribal habits, historical context, textual transmission, all the slow disciplines that are difficult to summarize in a headline, all of that remained indispensable. A machine may sift more quickly. It does not know what counts as a meaningful grain. There is pride in that, I think. Not the brittle pride that rejects new tools. A calmer kind. The pride of craft. The pride of people who know that a marathon cannot honestly be won by helicopter, no matter how impressive the helicopter. If the Voynich manuscript is ever truly read, the reading will likely come from collaboration, from patient work across fields, from machines doing what they do best and humans doing what they alone still can. Feeling context, weighing plausibility, hearing when a sentence has the grammar of meaning but not its soul, So where does that leave us tonight? With the same book, the same vellum, the same rooms of strange imagery and unread script, the same sense that someone 600 years ago made an object designed either to teach, to hide, or perhaps to delight in the act of hiding. And now, around that object, a new layer of history has gathered. The era when artificial intelligence stepped in, claimed for a moment to have found a way through, and then had to step back under the cool gaze of scholars who knew the difference between a spark and a sunrise. That does not lessen the magic of the manuscript. If anything, it deepens it. Because now the Voynich is not merely a medieval enigma. It is also a modern mirror. It reflects our hunger for answers, our trust in tools, our weakness for elegant stories, and our recurring need to be reminded that intelligence, whether human or artificial, is not measured by how quickly it speaks, but by how carefully it knows the limits of its own voice. Maybe that is why the manuscript continues to hold us. Not because it contains one final, terrible secret, though perhaps it does. Not because AI almost solved it, though it almost seemed to. It holds us because it creates a rare kind of stillness in an age addicted to immediate meaning. A book of unreadable text, surviving wars and institutions, and theories and laboratories, still able to look back at us with perfect composure and say nothing we can verify. That silence is not empty. It is shaped. It is a silence full of invitation and warning. And perhaps that is enough for now. Imagine the Yale Vault once more, or any quiet archive you prefer. The air cool, the light controlled, the world outside busy with its bright, restless confidence. Inside, the manuscript waits. Machines may come again. Better ones. Stranger ones. Human readers will come too, carrying dictionaries, cameras, probabilities, old frustrations, new hopes. The pages will open. The plants will still be impossible. The women will still move through their painted channels. The zodiac wheels will still turn without yielding their center. And somewhere in that room, perhaps only for an instant, someone will feel what all true mysteries offer. Not panic, not defeat, just a soft lowering of the head before something that has not yet agreed to become ordinary. That is not a bad place to leave the night. Not with a solution, but with a deeper companionship with the question. The machine failed to conquer the book. The scholars failed to close it. The manuscript itself remains what it has always been. A patient knot tied between language, image, secrecy, and time. We sit beside it a while longer, in the dimness, warmed not by certainty, but by the old human willingness to keep searching. Carefully, honestly, and with enough humility to know when the page has not spoken yet. The quiet after a false solution has its own atmosphere. It feels a little like the moment after someone insists they have recognized a face in the fog, only for the fog to thin and show nothing but damp air and distance. The excitement does not vanish at once. It lingers in the room. It clings to the edges of the conversation. But beneath it, something older begins to rise again. The manuscript itself, not the headlines around it, not the machine that claimed to hear Hebrew in its bones. The object, the vellum, the ink, the strange patience of the thing. Let us drift back to it slowly. Imagine a locked room, cool and careful, the sort of room where paper is treated almost like a sleeping animal. Light is controlled. Temperature behaves itself. The world outside may be rushing toward its next prediction, its next synthetic certainty, its next bright and brittle announcement. But in here, the pages rest in an older tempo, more than 200 pages, or something close to that depending on how you count the gatherings and the losses, made not from paper in the ordinary sense, but from vellum, the prepared skin of animals, smoothed and cut and bound into a book that has outlived empires, plagues, theories, and very confident men. That material fact matters. It is one of the few hard pieces of ground beneath our feet. The manuscript is not a modern prank on fresh paper. Carbon dating placed the vellum in the early 15th century. The book is old, deeply old by ordinary human standards. Not antique in the theatrical sense, not draped in convenient fake dust, but genuinely old enough to have been handled by fingers that believed the stars moved in a different kind of heaven. When people first hear that, they often relax for a moment. Old vellum feels reassuring. It pushes away the easier hoax theories. It tells us there really was a maker, or several makers, somewhere in late medieval Europe, who invested money, labor, and skill in creating this baffling thing. And then the unease returns, because if the book is authentic in age, then the question grows darker, not lighter. Why would someone in the 15th century produce a manuscript so elaborate, so full of internal order, and yet so resistant to ordinary reading? A prankster can draw nonsense once or twice. A bored forger can imitate mystery for a few pages. But the Voynich manuscript is not a doodle. It is a sustained act. That is what keeps pulling people back. It behaves like intention stretched over time. Wilfrid Voynich knew that the moment he saw it, when he emerged with the manuscript from a Jesuit collection in the early 20th century, he did not merely acquire a curious old book. He acquired a magnet, the kind of object that bends people toward it. He was a book dealer, yes, but also the sort of human creature who can smell the difference between rarity and disturbance. The manuscript had both. It came with no clear translation, no key, no companion text, no obvious place in the known family tree of scripts. Just page after page of disciplined strangeness. I sometimes think the illustrations are what deepen the spell. If the book were only text, it would still be maddening, but it might remain in the cold realm of cipher and language. The drawings drag it into dream. Plants that seem almost recognizable and then withdraw at the last instant, as if stitched from memory rather than observation. Circular diagrams like celestial wheels or bathing systems or cosmological maps. Small female figures, if figures they are, moving through green tubes and pooled shapes that look anatomical, astronomical, botanical, and impossible all at once. A medieval herbal would make sense. A medical manual would make sense. An alchemical notebook. Perhaps a private cosmology. Maybe. But the Voynich images do not settle obediently into any one cupboard. They slip. They blur category. They make the whole book feel as if it belongs to a branch of knowledge that diverged and then vanished. And this is where the silence around the text becomes so oppressive. Because the writing itself is not random in the way a child makes random marks. It has regularity. Words recur. Certain symbols prefer certain positions. Whole regions of the manuscript seem to obey local habits, like districts in a city sharing architectural style. That is why cryptographers, linguists, medievalists, and yes, computer scientists keep returning to it with that same strained mix of hope and restraint. The text behaves enough like language to be irresistible. Yet every time someone reaches for it, the book turns slightly, and the hand closes on air. Some early scholars hoped for an ordinary solution. If ordinary is the right word for anything involving this manuscript, perhaps it was a cipher made by a physician. Perhaps an encoded herbal meant to protect valuable knowledge. Perhaps a constructed language, a private script, a compressed shorthand used by a single circle of initiates. There were even romantic fantasies that it was the work of a famous mind. Roger Bacon was a popular candidate for a while, because human beings love to place mystery in the hands of names they already admire. But names do not solve manuscripts. They only give people something to whisper while the pages remain closed. Over the decades, the book attracted an extraordinary procession of minds. Renaissance dreamers in spirit, though not in time. Soldiers of code, historians of medicine, amateur sleuths working at kitchen tables under yellow light, professional cryptanalysts with discipline in their bones. Some approached the manuscript like a siege, others like a prayer. During the great age of code breaking in the 20th century, when humans learned that even the most intimidating systems might eventually give way under pressure, many assumed the Voynich would fall too. If war could crack state ciphers, surely a lonely medieval manuscript could not hold out forever. And yet it did. Alan Turing hovers over the story like a distant lamp, whether or not his involvement is sometimes exaggerated in popular retellings. The point is not only that brilliant code breakers touched the mystery, but that entire generations, shaped by the confidence of logic, found themselves unable to force it open. That failure changed the emotional weather around the book. It became not merely unread. It became legendary for remaining unread in the company of people who usually won. That reputation can be dangerous. Of course. Once an object becomes famous for resistance, every unsuccessful attempt adds to the aura. The manuscript begins to feed on disappointment. It becomes easier to mythologize than to study. People start hearing cosmic hums where there may be only vellum and ink. They start treating every broken theory as proof that the text is supernatural, or extraterrestrial, or a message from some hidden brotherhood tucked between history and folklore. I understand the temptation. The drawings invite it. The script invites it. The very fact of enduring unreadability invites it. But the manuscript is more unsettling when we keep it human. Human-made. Human hidden. Human forgotten. Because a human secret is often stranger than a supernatural one. A supernatural secret can do anything. A human secret must travel through hands and materials and motives. If someone wrote this book to conceal knowledge, then what knowledge? If someone wrote it as a hoax, Then why so much labor for a joke that might never be properly witnessed? If someone wrote it in a system known only to a small circle, why did the circle vanish so thoroughly that no clear echo of its method survived? If it is not a text in the ordinary sense at all, then what discipline of memory or ritual or performance once made use of these pages? Notice what happens here. The questions begin to branch, like roots in black water. Solve one and three more stir below it. The AI episode did not answer those questions. It only reminded us how hungry we are for any structure that feels like a path. Yet the manuscript itself keeps asking to be looked at more slowly. Even its handwriting encourages that. There may have been more than one scribe, or at least more than one hand in the shaping of the text. Subtle differences in the forms and spacing suggest variation, though not chaotic variation. To me, that detail always feels intimate. The possibility that the manuscript passed between people who shared a system now dead. A workshop of secrecy. A room where this writing was not mysterious at all, where someone could glance at a line and know what to say aloud, or know what medicine to mix, or know which star wheel corresponded to which season of the body. That thought can make the whole story ache a little, because if the script was once ordinary to someone, then the silence we feel now is not the natural silence of an impossible object. It is the silence of a broken chain. Someone knew. Then someone else knew less. Then less. Then no one. The book did not choose to become mute. It was abandoned by its own language community, if community there was. One of the reasons the manuscript remains so haunting is that it sits exactly at the point where material certainty and interpretive uncertainty cross. We know the vellum is old. We know the ink was laid by human hands. We know the script is consistent. We know the drawings are deliberate. We know the object moved through real collections and archives and was not invented yesterday to torment the internet. But once we step beyond those facts, the ground softens at once. The plants may be medicinal, or symbolic, or composite. The diagrams may be astronomical, or anatomical, or both in some forgotten framework where the sky and body mirrored one another so closely that distinction felt crude. The female forms may indicate bathing, fertility, alchemy, internal organs, or a symbolic cosmology in which life moved through vessels that were never meant to be purely literal. Honestly, that is where the manuscript begins to feel almost dangerous to certainty itself. Every discipline that approaches it finds something almost familiar and then loses grip. A botanist sees herbs and then finds the stems impossible. A historian of medicine sees humors and baths and fluid pathways, then notices the logic slipping sideways. A cryptographer sees regularity. A linguist sees resistance. An artist sees intention everywhere. A skeptic sees a performance. Everyone leaves with a fragment. No one leaves with the whole creature. This may be why the book attracts not just scholars, but a wider public. People who do not spend their days in archives and still feel tugged toward it. Most mysteries in the modern world are eventually reduced. The masked figure is named. The hidden mechanism is shown. The photograph is enhanced. The code is broken. The map is explained. But the Voynich manuscript has remained gloriously uncooperative. It lets each age project its machinery onto it and then endures. Alchemy, psychoanalysis, war-era cryptography, now machine learning. The book keeps absorbing new methods without surrendering its center. And still, one must not make a religion out of that resistance. I think that matters. The manuscript may someday yield. A forgotten source may surface. A parallel text may be discovered in some neglected collection. A patient team may find that the system is not impossible, only deeply inconvenient. Better image analysis may reveal erased guides or production clues. Ink studies may refine our understanding of its making. Computational tools may become genuinely useful partners rather than overeager prophets. None of that would diminish the book. A solved mystery does not become unworthy. It simply changes from a locked door into a room. But tonight, we are not in that room. We are still standing outside it, hand on the brass, feeling the old cold travel through the metal. If you were holding the manuscript in your lap, and let us pretend for a moment that the archive staff had lost all professional discipline and allowed such a thing, I think the first surprise would be how intimate it feels. Not enormous, not monstrous. A book-sized thing. Handmade. Tactile. The kind of object meant to be touched page by page. That intimacy is part of the unease. Vast mysteries usually live in vast spaces. Mountains. Oceans. Sky. The Voynich Manuscript reduces the unknown to something you could once have tucked under an arm. A whole sealed world in a volume. A private weather system of ink and skin. Maybe that is why people so often describe it in almost bodily terms. The vellum as skin. The text as pulse. The drawings as organs of a hidden discipline. The pages do seem to hum in the imagination. Not literally, perhaps, but in the way old objects hum when enough minds have pressed expectation into them. A book no one can read becomes more than a book. It becomes a surface onto which human longing writes itself over and over. The danger, of course, is that we stop looking at the manuscript and begin looking only at our own longing reflected back. The best scholars resist that. They return to the marks, the choir numbers, the ordering of folios, the recurring labels around diagrams, the distribution of signs, the possibility that some sections were composed under different constraints than others. The practical things, dry things, some might say, but dry things are what keep mysteries from dissolving into pure theater. Every great puzzle needs its caretakers, the people willing to count rather than proclaim, to compare rather than enchant. Without them, the manuscript would already have been swallowed by fantasy. And yet fantasy keeps circling, because the alternative is so stark that an object of this beauty and coherence may have been created for reasons so private, so local, so contingent, that history simply misplaced the key. No cosmic malice, no curse, no grand universal warning, just human secrecy and human fragility. Perhaps that is the darkest possibility of all. Not that the book contains a terrible revelation, but that it contains an ordinary revelation in a language no one remembers. And all the centuries since have built a cathedral of mystery around what may once have been practical. Then again, perhaps not. Perhaps the manuscript really does preserve knowledge someone wanted hidden. Knowledge about bodies, about plants, about stars, about a system of correspondence between flesh and cosmos that churchmen, physicians, or rivals would not have welcomed. Fact that the manuscript is written in a way that nobody else could read it suggests that it is preserving knowledge that someone wanted to keep secret. Those words have been spoken often enough that they almost sound rehearsed now. But there is a hard little truth inside them. Secrecy is expensive. If you are going to wrap knowledge in labor, or script invention, and visual complexity, you usually believe the knowledge matters, which leaves us where all good nights of thought tend to leave us, near the center, but not in it. Looking at the manuscript not as a machine problem alone, nor as a mystical icon alone, but as a stubborn human artifact that has endured by refusing the simplifications of every age. The AI came. It guessed. It stumbled. The book remained. The scholars objected. The headlines faded. The pages remained. And in that remaining there is something almost tender. A continuity of not yet. We can sit with that a little longer. We can let the manuscript remain what it has so long been. A handmade silence. A codex of almost recognition. A patient old object, keeping its small, dark counsel while generations lean over it, hoping that this time, at last, someone will hear the first clear word. And because it has remained, because the book kept its silence even after the machine had made its bright little claim, the story bent in a different direction. Away from triumph, away from that noisy modern hunger for a solved thing. It bent toward endurance, toward the older and perhaps more unsettling possibility that some mysteries do not survive because no one has looked hard enough, but because they are woven from several kinds of disappearance at once. That is what the Voynich Manuscript feels like to me now. Not a single lost meaning. A braid of lost meanings. There is the disappearance of language. The most obvious one. A script or code or system that no living reader can confidently inhabit. Then, the disappearance of context. The room in which the book made sense. The bodies around it. The habits of use. The voice that may once have moved, line by line across a page, and explained to an apprentice that this sign means prepare, this one means steep, this one means blood, this one means moon, this one means begin at dawn. Then there is the disappearance of trust. Every proposed answer over the years has trained us not to fall too quickly in love with the next one. Even genuine clues are now forced to walk through the wreckage left by earlier certainty. That last disappearance is especially strange. The manuscript has not only resisted reading, it has educated its readers into caution. It has made even the hopeful become measured. When new claims arrive, scholars no longer rush toward them with open arms. They approach sideways. They test. They frown. They wait for the old familiar collapse. In that sense, the book has shaped the psychology of its own investigation. It has trained us how to stand before it. The AI episode only deepened that training. It showed that even a system capable of comparing hundreds of languages at impossible speed can still be seduced by resemblance. And resemblance is the great seducer in every archive. A plant that looks almost like wormwood. A symbol that resembles a known ligature. a bathing pool that echoes a medical diagram, a circular chart that feels nearly astrological. The word almost does immense work in the story of this manuscript. Almost readable, almost familiar, almost solved, almost Hebrew, almost medicinal, almost celestial. The book lives in that almost as naturally as fish live in water. If you were to ask me, gently, what the AI really discovered, I would say it discovered the shape of our impatience. It discovered how quickly a machine-generated suggestion can be promoted into a cultural event if the object under examination has enough fame and enough silence around it. It discovered that people are deeply ready to believe a black box has opened an older black box, even when the opening is little more than a crack of light and a suspicious breeze. And it discovered something else too, something more useful. That pattern recognition alone cannot bridge the full distance between symbol and world. For a manuscript, Voynich Manuscript is not only a string of character statistics, it is also a social object, a performed object, a thing made for use within a web of assumptions. Ink on vellum is only the visible crust. Underneath lie conventions, purposes, learned gestures, and the pressures of a culture that may no longer know how to introduce itself. This is where human scholars still hold an advantage that no machine fully shares. A good manuscript expert knows that the page is never only the page. The page is a stage where habits leave traces. The spacing between lines, the ordering of quires, the distribution of labels around a drawing, the way one hand differs subtly from another, the practical economies of labor, the little physical compromises that reveal whether a book was planned in advance or grew as it was made. Machines can help count such things. They can even help surface them. But they do not yet live inside the kind of thick historical feeling required to decide which irregularities matter and which merely decorate the noise. A human expert looks at a line and sees not just statistical rarity, but scribal hesitation. Not just character clusters, but workshop rhythm. Not just image categories, but the inheritance of visual traditions. That kind of seeing is slow because it is layered. It must be fed by memory, comparison, skepticism, and at times by imagination disciplined enough to know its own boundaries. I have always found it strange that people frame this as a competition, human versus machine, as if the manuscript were an arena and one side must emerge carrying a severed solution above the crowd. The better image, at least for now, is companionship under difficult weather. The machine is a lamp that can be very bright in certain corners. The scholar is the one who knows whether the corner is part of the room or only a trick of the wall. Separate them, and each is limited. Together they may someday do something worthy of the manuscript. But together does not mean carelessly. Together means with rules, with patience, with the humility to report uncertainty as uncertainty. That last phrase is not glamorous, but it may be the most important one in the entire field. Report uncertainty as uncertainty. The AI headlines did the opposite. They inflated a probabilistic gesture into a solved riddle. And once the world says solved, the quieter and truer work becomes harder, because doubt begins to sound like obstruction rather than responsibility. Scholars had to spend energy unwinding an illusion before returning to the real questions. In that sense, bad certainty does not merely fail to help. It slows the path of better not knowing. Still, the book endured the spectacle. It always does. Perhaps that is another reason people love it. The Voynich Manuscript seems curiously immune to being used up. Every new theory feeds it, and somehow leaves it hungrier. Every failed solution adds one more ring to the tree. There are not many objects left in modern culture that can survive repeated overexposure and remain mysterious. Most are flattened by attention. The Voynich seems sharpened by it. Maybe that sharpness comes from the material beauty of the artifact itself. Even stripped of every grand theory, even if tomorrow we learn that the text was nothing more than an elaborate mnemonic system for a vanished circle of practical herbalists, the book would still be extraordinary. The drawings alone would ensure that. They are too coherent to dismiss, too unstable to settle. Their beauty is not the polished beauty of court illumination. It is the beauty of a mind trying to map a world from inside its own unusual logic. I think that is why even skeptics fall for the manuscript a little. It does not look accidental. It looks inwardly complete. That kind of completeness is seductive because it implies a missing worldview just beyond reach. There are moments when I wonder whether the most frightening possibility is not that the manuscript hides a forbidden revelation, but that it records a system of thought so local, so delicately bounded, that no amount of modern brute force will ever feel natural against it. A private garden of meaning. A script designed for a few people and then lost with them. If that is true, the manuscript may be less like a lock waiting for the correct key, and more like a song once known by a family line that vanished. You can analyze the notation forever. You may still never hear the voice that made it ordinary. And yet I cannot quite surrender to that melancholy. The history of scholarship is full of objects that seemed permanently sealed until one day they were not. Scripts once deemed impossible have yielded before. Forgotten languages have found companions in bilingual inscriptions, archive accidents, or the patient accumulation of partial truths. Even now, researchers continue to test the Voynich from angles that are less flashy and more promising. Multispectral imaging, ink analysis, scribal comparison, statistical modeling done with more caution, contextual studies of late medieval medicine and natural philosophy. None of this makes for a dramatic trailer. It may, however, be the sort of work that eventually produces a genuine crack. The challenge, of course, is that modern culture rarely rewards the genuine crack. It wants the clean breakthrough, the before and after, the solved stamp. But real decipherment, if it comes, may arrive in fragments so small the public barely notices. One repeated label identified. One section shown to follow, known herbal ordering. One category of symbols linked to line endings or rubric structure. One diagram revealed to mirror a specific medical schema. The great mystery may die not in a cinematic revelation, but by being slowly reduced, leaf by leaf, into partially familiar terrain. There is something both sad and beautiful about that, like watching a forest give up its darkness not at noon, but tree by tree as morning climbs. If that day comes, I hope people will be patient enough to honor it. I hope they will allow the manuscript to become readable in the same slow way it became legendary. The book deserves that much. Until then, what remains is the experience of standing before an object that refuses our usual bargain with knowledge. Usually, if we gather enough tools, enough experts, enough light, the world rewards us with increasing clarity. The Voynich Manuscript has not honored that bargain yet. It has accepted the light and stayed obscure. That can feel almost impolite, which is one reason people become dramatic around it. They begin to imagine hidden orders, deliberate traps, grand conspiracies of preserved forbidden wisdom. Fact that the manuscript is written in a way that nobody else could read it suggests that it is preserving knowledge that someone wanted to keep secret. There is no denying the force of that intuition. But secrecy comes in many temperatures. Not all secrets are apocalyptic. Some are simply practical. Some are professional. Some are devotional. Some are born of rivalry. Some are born of fear. A secret kept from neighbors can look as inscrutable 6 centuries later as a secret kept from kings. The AI claim that the result was not good for us, not good in some ominous wider sense, belongs to that older tradition of framing the manuscript as a warning. I understand why such framing works. The unreadable book in the vault. The modern machine. The sentence that half emerges and then collapses into unease. It sounds like the opening of a curse, but the truth is subtler and perhaps more chilling. The result was not good because it reminded us how easily meaning can be simulated, how easily our era confuses fluent output with real contact. The danger was not that the manuscript suddenly spoke something terrible. The danger was that we nearly accepted a counterfeit voice because it arrived through technology we already wanted to trust. That is not really a story about the 15th century. It is a story about us. And perhaps that is why the Voynich Manuscript feels so alive at the moment. It sits at the crossing of 2 kinds of mystery. The old mystery of the unread book, and the new mystery of systems that generate persuasive language without necessarily understanding. Put those 2 together, and you get a perfect modern fever dream. A manuscript no one can read, approached by a tool that can always say something. One silence. One endless speaker. No wonder people stared. The better response, I think, is slower and more humane. We can admire the tools without kneeling before them. We can let machine analysis widen the field of possibility without mistaking possibility for proof. We can keep listening to manuscript scholars whose expertise was earned not in sudden spectacle, but in decades of trained attention. We can remember that old objects do not owe us immediate clarity merely because our processors run hot. And we can allow mystery to remain intellectually fertile without forcing it into melodrama. Because there is a kind of peace in that posture. Not the peace of resignation. The peace of right proportion. The Voynich Manuscript is difficult. It may even be uniquely difficult. But difficulty is not defeat. Difficulty is often the shape a genuine object takes when it has traveled farther through time than the methods first brought to meet it. We are still learning how to meet this one. So tonight, as the story moves onward, I prefer to keep the manuscript where it belongs. Not solved by AI. Not disproved by AI either. Simply revealed more clearly as the sort of object that exposes the strengths and weaknesses of every age that touches it. The Renaissance collected it. The modern cryptographers attacked it. The computational age modeled it. None have owned it. That continuity is almost comforting. The book remains older than our fashions of certainty. If you were to leave the archive now and step out into the colder night, the mind would likely keep turning back to those pages. The impossible flowers, the clustered script, the sense that just beyond comprehension there is not emptiness, but order. Human beings are very sensitive to hidden order. We feel it in music before we can count it. We feel it in a face before we know why it is familiar. We feel it in the Voynich Manuscript too. That may be the deepest reason no one walks away for long. The book does not feel random enough to dismiss, and it does not feel legible enough to calm us. It occupies the narrow territory where curiosity becomes almost physical. And that is where we will leave it for now. Resting, waiting, holding its little storm of ink beneath controlled light. The AI has had its turn. The scholars have answered. The headlines have dimmed. The manuscript remains a handmade silence inside a loud century. It does not promise revelation. It does not promise safety either. It promises only this, that if we keep company with it long enough, carefully enough, it may continue to teach us something about the cost of certainty, the value of patience, and the old human habit of mistaking the first echo for the voice itself. There are worse lessons to carry into sleep than that. By the time the room grows quiet again, and the argument between confidence and caution has settled into a softer hush, something else begins to emerge from the story. Not an answer, not a key, something steadier than that. A sense that the manuscript has been teaching people how to look, even while refusing to be read. That may sound too generous toward an object made of vellum and ink, but old things often do this. They force a discipline upon the people who gather around them. They reveal vanity by frustrating it. They reward patience by refusing spectacle. They make us notice how badly we want a clean ending, and how quickly we are willing to decorate uncertainty with bright language when a clean ending does not appear. The Voynich Manuscript has done that again and again. Recently, researchers used advanced systems to compare the script against large bodies of known language. And what returned was not a revelation, but a warning about resemblance. The machine found shapes that leaned toward the familiar, then lost its footing. It offered the outline of certainty, and for a brief moment, many people rushed to stand inside it. Yet the manuscript did not change. It remained there on the table, quiet, unbothered, almost patient in its refusal. If you were standing here with me, listening to the fire settle lower, you might notice how strange that patience feels. Most puzzles want to be solved, at least in stories. They seem to reach toward the hand that solves them. This manuscript does not. It sits back. It lets every generation project its own cleverness toward it, then waits to see what remains after the noise has gone. And still, the noise is useful in its own way. Even failed approaches leave little traces of value. The AI did not decode the book, but it reminded scholars that large-scale comparison can still help narrow fields of possibility. It did not unlock a hidden Hebrew sentence, but it did push people to ask better questions about what kind of system the script might be. Language, cipher, constructed notation, mnemonic pattern, a written performance rather than a spoken one. The failure was loud, but beneath the loudness there were quieter movements, and those may matter more in the long run. That is often how difficult scholarship truly works. Not as one dramatic leap, but as a slow gathering of better refusals. A weak theory is tested, then set aside. A flashy claim is measured, then reduced. A seductive error is named, then removed from the path. What remains after enough of that work can begin to look like progress, though it rarely feels exciting while it is happening. Imagine a group of researchers years from now, perhaps already working somewhere under careful light, not chasing the dream of a sudden translation, but building a finer portrait of the manuscript as an object in time. Better imaging of the pages, better analysis of pigment and ink, better mapping of the scribal hands, better reconstruction of how the quires were once ordered before loss and rebinding altered the flow, better comparison with medical, botanical, and cosmological traditions from the late medieval world, better models trained not on modern language alone, but on historically appropriate corpora, and trained with less hunger for neatness. That work may not produce a single headline. It may produce 20 modest papers, each one with a title too calm for the modern appetite. Yet those papers may carry the true future of the mystery. One might show that a cluster of labels behaves more like indexing than prose. Another might establish that the so-called plant section borrows compositional habits from known herbals, even if the plants themselves remain transformed. Another might discover that the stars in one circular diagram correspond not to a zodiac in the usual sense, but to a regional cosmological tradition now only partly preserved. Another might prove that one part of the manuscript was copied from an earlier exemplar, while another part was freshly composed. None of these findings would look like conquest. Together, they might amount to the first real conversation anyone has had with the book in centuries. I have always found that possibility more beautiful than the fantasy of a perfect instant decode. A perfect decode belongs to dreams of domination. A real understanding would likely arrive the way dawn arrives in a winter field, not all at once, but in bands of growing recognition. First the hedge, then the gate, then the frost on the path, then the shape of the church tower beyond the trees. The world not changing, only becoming visible in sequence. And yet even that image may be too optimistic. We must leave room for a harder truth. The manuscript may never yield completely. Some losses may be permanent. A cultural context can vanish so thoroughly that only its shell remains. If the writing was deeply private, or compressed according to conventions known only to a small circle, then the pages may resist full restoration forever. We might recover domains of meaning without recovering every sentence. We might learn what kind of knowledge the book held without learning every claim it made. We might hear the rhythm without regaining the song. That too would be a form of knowledge. In a way, scholars already live with that partial condition all the time. Ancient history is full of broken inscriptions, missing endings, scattered leaves, names without bodies, bodies without names. The fantasy that everything should eventually become perfectly clear is not a historical habit. It is a modern emotional demand. The past is often legible only in fragments. The real miracle is not total clarity, The real miracle is that fragments can still speak when handled with enough care. The Voynich manuscript may simply be asking for a more mature kind of listening than most mysteries receive. Not the hungry listening that waits for a confession. The slower listening that allows a thing to remain partly itself. That may be why this book continues to pull not just specialists, but ordinary people who feel something stir when they see a page of its script. You do not need to know codicology, cryptography, or medieval medicine to feel the tension it carries. The eye sees order. The mind cannot enter. That gap is immediate, almost bodily. It reminds us that meaning can exist without our possession of it. In a culture that expects access to nearly everything, that reminder lands with unusual force. The manuscript also asks something harder. It asks whether we can love an object without forcing it to flatter our preferred tools. The cryptographer wants a cipher. The linguist wants language. The historian of medicine wants a medical book. The art historian wants visual lineage. The machine learning researcher wants pattern recoverable at scale. Each of these desires is understandable. Each may contain part of the truth. Trouble begins when desire hardens into premature ownership. Recently, researchers fed large language comparisons into machine models, hoping the old script would finally confess what family it belonged to. And what returned was not a confession, but a mirror. The machine reflected our own habits back at us. It showed how quickly numerical similarity can be mistaken for historical meaning. It showed how fluency in output can make weak reasoning feel stronger than it is. It showed that the modern mind remains deeply vulnerable to anything that sounds smooth enough in public. That lesson matters beyond this one manuscript. The Voynich simply offers the lesson in miniature, on vellum, under glass. I think that is part of why the story continues to feel slightly eerie, even when told in the softest possible voice. It is not eerie because we stand on the edge of an occult revelation. It is eerie because the book quietly exposes the limits of each age that tries to master it. The Renaissance wanted hidden wisdom. The scientific age wanted a code. The digital age wanted a pattern match. The book accepted all of this attention and remained itself. That steadiness can feel almost sentient, though of course it is not. It is the steadiness of a well-made human artifact whose makers did not imagine our era, and therefore did not shape it to please our methods. There is a comfort in that too. The comfort of resistance. The world has not become so transparent that every old silence can be flattened on command. There are still corners where patience must outlive performance. There are still archives where humility does better work than speed. There are still books that make us earn the right even to speculate near them. If you were to spend enough time with the Voynich manuscript, not just as a headline but as an object, I suspect you would eventually stop asking only what it says, and begin asking what kind of world could make such a thing feel necessary. A world where knowledge traveled through guarded circles. A world where images and words and bodies and stars were not sharply separated. A world where writing might conceal not because truth was monstrous, but because knowledge was power, currency, status, intimacy, or danger. A world where a manuscript could function as medicine, memory, devotion, and defense all at once. That imagined world may be closer to the truth than any single translation. And once you begin to feel it, the pages grow heavier in the hand of thought. The plants become less like puzzles and more like products of a mind trained to combine observation with symbol. The bathing figures become less like absurdities and more like clues to a physiological or spiritual map we only partly remember. The text becomes less like gibberish and more like the surface of a discipline whose grammar has slipped beneath the floorboards of history. Honestly, there is something tender in that possibility. Tender and sad. The idea that a real system of care, or learning, or ritual may survive only as a mute arrangement of signs. That human beings once used these pages with familiarity, then vanished so completely that we now call their ordinary marks mysterious. A forgotten literacy is one of the quietest tragedies history can produce. And still, tragedy is not the whole mood. There is also companionship. Every generation that sits with the manuscript adds another circle of witness around it. Even failed readers become part of its afterlife. Voynich himself, the early collectors, the cryptographers, the historians, the skeptics, the dreamers, the careful women and men in archives who turn the leaves and return them to sleep, the impatient journalists, the earnest programmers, the machine models chewing through character strings at impossible speed. None have solved it. All have, in some way, joined its long weather. Perhaps that is enough for tonight, not because the story is exhausted, but because the manuscript teaches a gentler rule than ordinary mysteries do. It does not reward the final blow. It rewards staying near. So let us stay near a little longer. Let the room dim. Let the fire lower itself by degrees. Let the thought of those pages rest where it belongs, not in panic, not in triumph, but in patient attention. The book remains where it has long remained. Old skin, old ink, strange gardens, circular heavens, unreadable lines laid down by someone who surely did not imagine machine learning, university press releases, or headlines about silicon oracles. Yet here we are, bringing all of that noise to a manuscript built in another season of the world, and finding that the old object still has the power to hush us. There is dignity in that hush. And in the hush, perhaps, the first honest step toward understanding. There is one more image that returns to me whenever I think about future work on the manuscript. Not a laboratory, not a press conference. A single reader at a long table in winter. A lamp bent low. A page opened flat beneath soft weights. Outside the window, evening thickening on the stone. Inside, the slow turning of notes. No certainty. No audience. Only the old discipline of staying with what resists you until the resistance itself begins to reveal structure. That reader is part of the story too. Perhaps the truest part, because the manuscript has always lived in that human scale. However famous it becomes, however many digital scans spread across the world, its real life still happens one gaze at a time. One comparison, one doubt carefully written into a margin. One moment when a researcher notices that a symbol thought to be decorative actually behaves consistently in one section and not another. One moment when a pigment sits slightly differently on the page. suggesting a new phase of work. One moment when a recurring form near a plant root begins to resemble a label rather than a flowing word. These are tiny recognitions. Yet all durable knowledge is built from tiny recognitions that refuse to flatter themselves. So perhaps the manuscript is not only a locked room, perhaps it is also a training ground. It asks each visitor to leave behind one more layer of impatience before entering. It asks the coder to admit the limits of numbers. It asks the historian to admit the limits of context. It asks the dreamer to admit the seduction of projection. And if those admissions are made honestly, the reward is not sudden mastery, but a cleaner kind of attention. That attention may be the nearest thing to truth the manuscript has given us so far. Even now, with all our machines humming and all our databases swelling, I suspect the final path, if a final path exists, will still depend on that old human skill. The skill of looking without rushing to possess. The skill of hearing silence without stuffing it with your own echo. The skill of admitting that the page is older than your method and may therefore require from you not dominance, but apprenticeship. That is a beautiful thing to ask of us, even if it leaves us waiting. Once you allow the room to become still enough, the story begins to soften around the edges. Not because the mystery is solved. It is not. Not because the warnings have passed. They have not entirely passed either. But because every long investigation, if it is to become a sleep story rather than a wound, must eventually settle into the quieter truths beneath its own drama. The quietest truth here may be this. The Voynich Manuscript is not frightening because it hides a single monstrous answer. It is frightening because it reminds us that knowledge can survive longer than understanding. A book can outlive its own voice. Symbols can remain intact, while the habits that once animated them disappear like breath in cold air. And when that happens, later ages will circle the artifact with all their clever tools and still feel, beneath the skill and heat and brightness, the old loneliness of not being able to ask the maker what they meant. That loneliness is human, deeply human. It is the same feeling one gets in abandoned houses, where the table is gone but the indentation of its legs still marks the floor. The same feeling in ruined monasteries, where wind now crosses the place where prayer once had structure. The same feeling in family stories when one name survives but the face has been lost. The manuscript belongs to that family of absences. It is not empty. It is overfull with a meaning that has become difficult to enter. Recently, researchers turned advanced models onto the script, searching for the hidden regularities of language. And what the models returned was a shimmer of possibility, then collapse. Not a revelation, not a door opened wide. A shimmer, a warning, a reminder that modern intelligence, whether biological or synthetic, can still be fooled by things that look like patterns from far away and dissolve into mist when approached too quickly. That may seem disappointing, but disappointment has its own value. It clears the room of false fanfare. It gives the manuscript back its proper silence. And once the false fanfare leaves, what remains is unexpectedly gentle. A vellum book made by real hands. Pages prepared, folded, bound, ink laid down with care. Drawings colored by someone who believed the images mattered. A text, line after line, in a system that was consistent enough to survive its own forgetting. Even now, that consistency is a kind of kindness. It tells us the makers were not mocking us. They were doing something that made sense to them. We are the ones who arrived late. That thought changes the emotional weather of the whole story. Instead of standing before a hostile object, we may be standing before a stranded one. A manuscript cut loose from the shore that once explained it. That does not make it less mysterious. It makes it more deserving of tenderness. If you were holding it tonight, and we have already indulged this impossible fantasy once, so we may as well let it return. I think you would notice first how the pages carry time without announcing it. Old vellum does not shout that it is old. It settles into age. It becomes quieter than paper. It bends differently. It remembers its animal life in the way it receives light. Such pages invite slow fingers. They do not welcome the modern habit of rushing to the next page for the next answer. They ask to be regarded the way one regards frost on a window or the surface of dark water. Not grabbed. Not conquered. Seen. Perhaps that is why the manuscript still seems to produce better thoughts in slower rooms. Archives. Libraries. The kind of studies where notes are written by hand and daylight takes its time leaving the wall. The book belongs to that tempo. It has survived the age of war ciphers. It has survived the age of television mystery. It has survived the age of the internet thread. It has now survived the age of the algorithmic breakthrough. Through all of this, it continues to insist, wordlessly, on a more ancient pace. There is wisdom in that. Whether or not the text itself contains wisdom in any ordinary sense, I sometimes think the best way to honor the manuscript is not to ask what secret it contains, but to ask what kind of behavior it calls forth in those who approach it well. Care, restraint, precision, humility, a willingness to say, not yet. A willingness to let another discipline speak when your own reaches its limit. A willingness to resist applause when applause arrives too early. These are scholarly virtues. Yes. They are also human ones. The manuscript may remain unread, but it has already taught those virtues to many people who tried to read it. And that, in its own quiet way, is a kind of translation. The machine translated a line into something smooth and strange and unconvincing. The manuscript itself has translated generations of ambition into patience. That seems far more real to me. It has taken bright minds and made them slower. It has taken certainty and thinned it into method. It has taken sensational desire and, after enough failures, taught even the most eager observer to lower the voice. Not in defeat, in respect. If you were standing here with me now, in this dim room, the fire almost down to embers, I think I would tell you that this is the most hopeful part of the story. Not that a hidden truth is waiting just out of sight, though perhaps it is. Not that some future system will finally take pity on us and speak the book aloud, though perhaps that too may happen in part. The hopeful part is that human beings keep returning to the unreadable without turning away in bitterness. They keep learning new methods. They keep comparing notes. They keep preserving what they do not yet understand. That is one of our better instincts. To guard the thing before we can explain it. The people who made the manuscript are gone. The first readers, if readers there were, are gone. The chain broke somewhere in the long dark between then and now. But the book did not disappear. It passed through hands that did not know its language and was still kept. It entered collections where no one could solve it and was still kept. It crossed centuries of neglect and fashion and still emerged into our own era with enough body left to be studied, argued over, and wondered at. That survival is not an accident only. It is also the result of custodianship, of repeated human decisions to say this object matters, even though I cannot yet tell you why. There is something very moving in that. And perhaps that is the final thing the AI episode can teach us. The manuscript does not need us to pretend it has spoken when it has not. It needs us to keep faith with difficulty, to preserve the page better than the headline, to value the careful objection more than the dramatic claim, to recognize that a book can remain powerful without becoming immediately useful. In a restless world, that is almost a moral lesson. Outside the archive, outside the labs and articles and arguments, the night carries on in its ordinary way. Streetlights hum, windows darken one by one. Somewhere a student is still scrolling through images of the manuscript on a glowing screen, convinced that one more hour of looking might reveal the trick. Somewhere a scholar closes a notebook and decides that a small result is enough for today. Somewhere a server cools after processing one more statistical pass across the script. Somewhere, the real vellum pages lie under careful protection, saying nothing, losing nothing, simply waiting in the one language all old objects know, the language of endurance. And now, as the story slows, the manuscript begins to feel less like a challenge and more like a companion to the long human task of not knowing beautifully. We do not speak often about that task. We celebrate discovery. We celebrate mastery. But there is also grace in living beside an unanswered thing without making it uglier through force. There is grace in letting mystery remain precise, in refusing to stuff it with theatrical shadows just because the plain dark is not enough for our nerves. The Voynich Manuscript deserves that grace. It has been given enough noise, so let us leave it where it rests, in its quiet vault, with its impossible flowers and patient circles and lines of script that still hold together after 600 years of weather. Let us leave the machine reports where they belong too, as interesting sparks, as incomplete efforts, as part of the long modern attempt to hear an older music. Let us leave the scholars in their lamps of concentration, and the archivists in their careful guardianship, and the book in its small, unbroken dignity. The secret, if there is one, can sleep a little longer. And perhaps that is not a failure. Perhaps every age needs at least one object that will not fully surrender. One object that keeps alive the ancient fact that the world is still deeper than our current instruments. The manuscript may be such an object, a handmade silence that asks for better listening, a stranded world that still radiates order, a reminder that not every old voice returns as speech. Sometimes it returns as discipline, sometimes as wonder, sometimes as the slow lowering of the breath when the mind finally accepts that the page in front of it is real and beautiful and not yet open. The fire is lower now. The room is dimmer. The hardest edges of the story have softened into the gentler weight of thought. Somewhere, Very far away in the imagination, the manuscript rests closed, its cover quiet, its vellum leaves settled, its unreadable lines waiting without urgency. Nothing is chasing us anymore. Not the machine, not the scholars, not the promise of a breakthrough. Only the soft truth that some mysteries remain kind enough to keep us company, even when they do not explain themselves. Let your shoulders loosen now. Let the old pages drift farther from the center of the mind. Let the strange flowers blur into green and gold. Let the circles dim into candlelight, and then into dark. The book will still be there tomorrow, patient as ever, and the people who care for it will still be there too, turning it carefully under the same measured light, listening for whatever small, honest thing it may one day offer. For tonight, that is enough. The manuscript does not need to be solved for the mind to rest beside it. It only needs to be allowed to remain what it has always been, a quiet survivor from another century, keeping its counsel while the centuries lean close and listen. And as you let that thought sink lower, you may notice that the manuscript has already done something very rare. It has survived being turned into entertainment without fully becoming entertainment. It has survived being fed into systems built to flatten uncertainty into output, and still it remains uncertain in the right way. That is no small achievement. Many old things are stripped of their dignity by modern attention. This one, somehow, has kept it, perhaps because the pages themselves still insist on slowness, on texture, on the old bodily facts of reading. Ink dried by time, vellum faintly warping with age, illustrations that require the eye to linger instead of skim. Even in digital form, one can feel the ghost of that slowness. The manuscript resists scrolling. It wants turning. It wants pause. It wants the kind of looking that softens a person rather than sharpens them into victory. So let the book stay closed now in the mind, not as a refusal, but as a promise of future company. Let the unread lines remain gentle. Let the flowers that do not quite belong to any earthly garden fold back into their green sleep. Let the circles drift farther away, like lanterns on dark water. Let the scholars keep their lamps. Let the machines cool. Let the archive hold its breath around the resting leaves. And let yourself do the simplest thing of all. Let go of the need to solve before you sleep. Some stories do not ask that of you. Some stories ask only that you sit beside them long enough to feel their age, their care, their silence, and then allow that silence to become restful rather than sharp. Tonight, the manuscript can keep its secret. Tonight, you can keep your peace. The night outside can carry the unanswered things for a while. It can hold them the way old libraries hold dust and lamplight, without judgment, without hurry. You do not have to carry the whole mystery into sleep, only the softer outline of it. An old book, careful hands, a long chain of keepers, a silence that has not been broken, and yet has never been empty. Just that. Just enough to feel the mind settle around it like a blanket warming by degrees. Good night.